As the many time featured song What a Difference a Day Makes, in this case it's probably more like what a difference 10 years makes. What I mean by all that, we'll find out right after the drop. And with that, hello and welcome to a new episode of Review, where we today will take a closer look at an Airbus A320-200 of Air New Zealand. At the front of the box we have a cutout so we can get a glimpse of the aircraft model inside, and on top of the box we have the Air New Zealand branding. Now, on the back side we find a lovely image of the aircraft in real life. We have the Air New Zealand branding alongside some additional information. What a lovely box design. Who would have thought Herpa being capable of such a thing? And here she is, the Airbus A320-200 in the current standard livery of Air New Zealand. This is to date the only A320, or any narrowbody for that matter, in the current standard livery of Air New Zealand we've seen in Scale 500 made by Herpa Wings or any other manufacturer. This model particularly was made by Herpa Wings back in 2014, and why this is important, well, I will get into a bit later in the video, because first we will simply focus on the aircraft model itself and see what it has to offer for collectors. Starting off with the tour around the aircraft model, we take a look at the tail section, where we on the vertical stabilizer have the legendary Koro-inspired design that is the Air New Zealand logo to date. On the fuselage we then find the New Zealand fern and the full registration code of the aircraft, and towards the very tail of the aircraft we have a bit of detailing around the APU exhaust. At the front of the aircraft and across the fuselage we then have the writing of Air New Zealand, and we also find a Star Alliance logo, of which the airline became a full member in 1999. Unfortunately, at the time this model was released, Herpa didn't really add any other details related to an aircraft, so like static ports or sensors, so we don't really find any of that here at the front of the aircraft, nor around the cockpit section, but we do have the cockpit windows, the window wipers, and above the cockpit windows the last two letters of the registration code printed on. Now, if we take a quick look at the engine nacelles, we can see they have been kept in white, just as most of the fuselage. We do have the silver leading edge printed on, but that's also the only printed detail we find at the engines. The physical detailing, however, is actually quite nice, where we here at the front can see the engine fan blades. And then on the fuselage, just above the wings, we have the emergency exits printed on, which leads us straight to the wings, which we should also take a closer look at, starting off with the top side, where we have the different flaps, slats and spoilers carved out, maybe a little bit drowned away by the grey base paint, but we do have some different shades of grey for additional detailing, and we also have the markings for the emergency exits printed on, looking quite lovely. The underside of the wings has more nice physical detailing, and we find the full registration code of the aircraft. We then of course also have the winglets with the lovely Air New Zealand logo printed on. Now, nowadays with Herpa Wings you would need to check up on the winglets being shaped correctly or bent correctly. This was not really an issue back when this aircraft model was released, and as we can see, they look perfectly fine. Then we should most definitely also take a look at the landing gear, because it's worth it. Now, this is the standard landing gear that Herpa used back in 2014. It has since changed, and that is important. The main landing gear looking just fine, but particularly the front landing gear looking much better than what we get from Herpa Wings today, and also being fairly sturdy. The only issue here I have is that we are of course missing printed details. Now, had this been a current Herpa Wings release, we would now on the belly of the aircraft find a hole in the fuselage for a stand that is not included with this aircraft model. But as this is not a current Herpa Wings release, we don't have such a hole, and since we don't have any stands included, we also don't need them, so there's no need to destroy any printed details, as Herpa nonsensically does nowadays. And then last but not least, we do also have the doors to the cargo compartments printed on here at the back of the aircraft, and also here at the front of the aircraft. So there we have it, the Airbus A320-200 in the current standard livery of Air New Zealand from Herpa Wings in scale 1 to 500, and what can we say about this aircraft model? Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this model was made back in 2014, and that is important because this is pretty much just around the time when Herpa peaked. You will of course rightly say, but Herpa models nowadays have many more details, so how can this be the peak of Herpa Wings? Well, frankly, this is because this is one of the last model generations from Herpa Wings which was released without the typical Herpa nonsense, as I would like to call it. Firstly, although the aircraft model does not have as many printed details as current Herpa Wings releases, the print quality is of a very high standard. Secondly, and quite crucially, we have a much better A320 mold than what we get from Herpa Wings nowadays. Especially the cockpit shape is so much better than any current Herpa Wings release. Thirdly, we have a much better looking landing gear. Now, this is not the most realistic landing gear Herpa has ever used. The previous generation of landing gear they used was even better looking, but this for me was always the best landing gear they used on the A320 family aircraft, as it basically combined looking fairly realistic with much better sturdiness than the previous generation of landing gear, and hands down and very easily beats the current landing gear we get from Herpa Wings on A320 family aircraft models. And if you think that I'm done, well, far from it, because models from that generation also still had actual quality, not just quality control, but quality. These models did not just fall apart while looking at them, and most crucially as well, were sold for reasonable prices. So hands down, despite not having as many printed details as current Herpa Wings releases, this aircraft model still beats any current A320 from Herpa Wings. With that, we have reached the end of today's episode. If you have enjoyed this video, then feel free to leave a like, and if you're new here, why not hit subscribe. With that, thanks so much for watching, hope to see you soon again. I'm checking out, and bye.